My name is public, yet at the same time very private. I'm a Catholic priest living in the United States. You can call me Father Grey, or PadreGrey, if you prefer. It was an old moniker amongst my close friends at the seminary, since I was sprouting silver locks on my scalp at the age of 22. The name didn't disseminate beyond the group, however, so it seems safe enough to use. If you find yourself recognizing me as you read through my stories, though, please keep things quiet. It's not that I fear any reprisal for giving out actual names, it's just generally frowned upon. You see, I'm currently the chief exorcist for my rather large diocese, and the names of exorcists are generally kept a secret. Now, Padre, you might think, surely that's a bit much. I can understand folks in the past blaming every bump in the night or every psychiatric episode on ghosts and demons, but a man in the 21st century, in the current year? Yes, my friends, in the current year. Not every bump in the night, of course. Carbon monoxide, settling houses, even infrasound phenomenon can explain quite a lot. Not every psychiatric episode either. I suppose much of this is common cultural knowledge at this point, since everyone loves a good ghost story, but the process of procuring a visit from me is staggering, to say the least. Psychological evaluations, physicians' visits, we even let skeptics tag along for objectivity. Admittedly, the pool of these narrows year by year. I have personally received about a dozen into the church following their experiences with me. The days of the local parish priest in the Middle Ages doubling as an exorcist are long gone, in part due to their zeal in diagnosing every random ailment as demonic activity. The church, at least as an entity, since I'm certain many of her hierarchy are functional atheists, take this seriously, and so do I. I suppose that's partly why I'm writing this. At a certain point, everyone must reckon with the events of their past, which made them who they are today. As I grow into my role, and grow even more gray, it seems that recounting my tales for the sake of permanence is something I have an obligation to do. So far, these have only been shared with my spiritual director. There are tales of possession, hauntings, and sheer human terror. But, and I firmly believe this, light always shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. So where to begin? Perhaps my first time. You never forget your first, they say. I was fresh out of seminary in the spring of 2008, newly ordained and arrived at my first parish assignment. The smell of chrism was still fresh on my hands, not even a day after arriving at St. Matthew's, a gorgeous suburban parish that looked suspiciously more like an office building than a church, which I was prepared to rough out for the next year or two. I received a call from the vicar for clergy. For those unaware of how church structure works, this is someone who works directly under the bishop to organize and keep tabs on all the priests in their diocese. His role is mostly figuring out which parishes to send clergy to, so my assumption was that he wanted to check in on my arrival. I clicked the answer button on my brick of a phone. Monsignor Phillips, a pleasure to hear from you.
Gray, hope you're settling into St. Matthew's well. How is Father David?
Father David was the pastor of St. Matthew's. Being a baby priest, as the newly ordained are called, I was only slated to be assigned as a parochial vicar, or, in more of an understandable term, an assistant pastor, for a few years until I had some experience under my belt. He's well enough, keeping busy. I'm looking forward to getting to know the place better.
Ah, well, about that,
he paused, and in his characteristic Joker style, he drew out the bombshell.
St. Matthew's may be a bustling soccer mom parish, but they are not in any need of a second priest.
Huh. So, am I taking up some kind of ministry while I'm living here?
No.
I don't quite get what you mean then, I said, confused.
Gray, his voice had suddenly developed a cold command. Bishop Joseph has been keeping some tabs on you for the past few years. He's been impressed with your academics, but above all, your spiritual development. Just keep this between us. The seminary described you as their most mature graduate in some years.
I was taken aback. Me? Spiritually mature? The idea seemed ludicrous. Sure, I had developed a solid schedule of prayer, being at Mass daily, and engaging in personal prayer, but it seemed like the other men were doing the same thing.
As you know, Monsignor Philip continued, interrupting my own thought process, The Holy Seat has been rather harshly coming down on American churches for its problems.
You don't have to tell me twice, I thought to myself.
To say nothing of the moral character of some of the clergy over the past decade. The Pope seems to have identified a more particular attitude of spiritual abandonment among the hierarchy here. Lack of piety, spiritual utilitarianism, modernism, the works. I knew very well the attitude that he mentioned. One of the practices we've been almost universally lax in is maintaining a group of diocese exorcists.
I didn't like the direction he was heading with this, not one bit.
Gray, you've been asked by the bishop to attend the Vatican's upcoming workshop on exorcism, and to consider accepting the charges as an exorcist of the diocese. Do you accept?
I felt a lump in my throat. Sure, one accepts the existence of the spiritual realm as a prerequisite for becoming a priest, but at the same time, did I really believe in it? Or rather, did I really believe I could handle it? Yet, with all these doubts swirling in my mind, the word came right out with almost no hesitation. Okay.
Good. Your address and technical assignment will remain at St. Matthew's for anonymity. Mail will be forwarded to you in Rome. Swing by my office tomorrow morning and we'll get everything underway. Until then, take care.
I pressed the end button on the phone and sat down to think. Now, you might be thinking this is where the story picks up. I assure you my time in Rome was less than eventful, though. I was there for a few months to attend classes and lectures, did a few practicums, heard some scary stories, was given a copy of The Rites of Exorcism, and was sent on a plane back home, scheduled to begin a new assignment with the only exorcist in our diocese. I began to wonder what I had even been nervous about. Then, I met Father Kelly. It was a cool autumn day when I arrived at St. Justine's, an old urban parish in a very large city with a reputation for being old school. The pastor had a reputation for being no nonsense, but a bit eclectic. He was lovingly referred to as Crazy Kelly, but only out of earshot. Parking my car on the street and sticking a few coins in the meter, I suddenly became aware of how imposing the facade of St. Justine's was. Tall, neo-Gothic spires, dark stone and brickwork, stained glass probably as old as the city itself. The rectory, situated to the left of the church itself, was much the same. I only picked up my suitcase from the car, figuring I'd score some special parish parking later to unload the rest of my luggage. I walked through the gates and approached the decrepit-looking archtop door, raising my hand to knock. Suddenly the door was opened with a drawn-out squeal as the figure of Father Kelly filled the space. He was older, in his 80s at the time, a bit shorter than me, probably 5'10", thin, slightly gaunt, but lively looking. His hair, far beyond mine, was properly silver. He wore vintage-looking half-moon spectacles, and was dressed in a priest's simplest and most characteristic attire, the black cassock.
Gray, is it?
He almost sounded excited, at least as much as a hoarse, elderly voice could.
What an absolute pleasure.
He reached out his hand and grabbed mine, shaking the daylights out of me with a strength I wouldn't have expected from someone even half his age. "Father Kelly," I said, cordially straightening my posture and reciprocating the handshake. "Very nice to meet you as well."
"Oh, please,"
he said jovially, breaking the handshake and waving his hand in the door.
"I only make demons call me father. Drives 'em batshit."
Admittedly, I was taken off guard, but he continued walking through the foyer, waving me to continue through the very cozy living room. A brick fireplace provided glowing light and warmth. Cushioned chairs and the smell of books abounded. Despite his erratic personality, it was clean as a whistle.
"We're gonna be living together, so we'd best get a casual name basis going. I'll call you Gray if you like, and you can call me Kelly, or just CK."
He paused and glanced over his shoulder.
"Don't act like you don't know what that means."
He smiled and sat down in an old chair, motioning for me to take the opposite one. I sat down, placing my suitcase to my side. We exchanged some pleasantries, spoke about specifics regarding the parish, including the parking, which was conspicuously hidden in an alleyway behind the church itself, and then seemed to naturally gravitate to the topic at hand. "So, given what you said within a minute of greeting me, I take it that you're the current exorcist." CK laughed, giving a small but dramatic bow of his head.
"At your service, kid. Been at it for 50-odd years now. since around 1954. He paused and stared at the fire for a moment. Lots of changes. Lots stay the same.
He glanced at my suitcase.
Got a ritual in there?
I perked up. Yes, actually. They gave us one at the end of the program. I grabbed the suitcase and unbuckled it, handing him the book. Red hardcover, golden papal seal, embossed on the front. For a moment, I almost anticipated being able to give it some wear. CK curtly laughed.
Oh, Jesus, they're really making things hard on you guys.
He tossed the book casually into the fireplace, where it started to go up in flames. I jumped up, having a moment of panic as I wondered what sort of crazy Father Kelly actually was. But, I worked for months to get that, I stuttered, unsure what to do. CK had already stood up, walking me to a nearby bookshelf.
That ain't the ritual, kid.
I took a moment to collect myself. What do you mean? CK turned to me with a raised eyebrow, still thumbing through the bookshelf.
I mean, that ain't the ritual. When it comes to our line of work, Gray, what works is what works. I'll take what's been handed down to us by tradition over something drawn up in a committee meeting in the 70s? Pfft. There it is.
He handed the book to me, and we sat back down. He kept silent, almost anticipating my desire to look through it. The Latin text, though slightly yellowed over time, was clearly discernible. The content was noticeably different, even to my amateur eye, from the book I had previously been given.
We can wax philosophy about the nature of changing times later, but suffice to say, the book you had wasn't worth its weight in salt. This is the real deal. This is what works.
I gave him a short nod.
So, ready for your first assignment?
He said, almost giddily jumping up. I was almost shocked at the delivery. I just got here, and I'm not even familiar with this new book.
Oh no, nothing like that. Just a sort of character assignment. Come into the office and I'll give you the details.
For the sake of brevity, I won't tell you the entirety of our conversation. Perhaps also for the sake of the person in question as well. CK had been apprised of a potential case by the bishop's office, although the details were not entirely clear yet. No evaluation had been done, but something about the case, and he would not elaborate on what, led to the bishop to ask CK to investigate it first.
I'm a bit old for this investigation stuff, or rather, I'm old enough that young blood should get the chance to shine, CK said with a little laugh.
The assignment was simple. Visit an apartment in Chinatown, evaluate a 25-year-old man, and report my findings back to CK.
Nothing too complicated. Just visit, talk with the family, evaluate the patient, write down some observations, and come back here to see me. I'll keep the lights on for you.
And so, off I went. It was evening at this point, and the reflectiveness of the city's buildings made golden hour particularly beautiful. I almost doubted what my work was, even as I drove up to the otherwise normal-looking apartment building, and felt something hollow in my stomach. I parked my car on the curb, getting out and fumbling with putting my keys in the pocket of my own black cassock, worn now as CK had insisted. The uniform, he called it. Before I could even get to the door of the tall, brutalist apartment building, an Asian family had opened it, congregating on the stoop and staring at me. 2 men, similar looking enough to be brothers, 2 women, probably their wives, a handful of children and adults of various ages. I slowed my walk a bit, taking in their expressions. They were dressed nicely, almost too nicely for home. The women had their makeup done, the men had combed their hair, but it was all a veneer. Underneath they looked exhausted, faces flushed, eyes red or glazed over, and their expressions somewhere between hopeless and longing. I stood on the sidewalk in front of them. I'm Father Grey. I'm here to call on someone? The oldest looking man just stared at me, opening and closing his mouth for a few minutes. "No," came the voice of one of the women, blue eyeshadow concealing dark bags around her eyes. "We knew in America, Catholic." She pulled a rosary from her pocket, smiling as she showed it to me. I smiled back and relied on body language to get me where I needed to be. I gestured myself through the door, and the men led me up the stairs while the rest of the group remained on the stoop.
After climbing a handful of stories, he paused, pulling out a key and unlocking an apartment door. We walked inside. There were signs of life, dinner on the table, TV playing. It seemed, at least at the time, that they had somehow known of my arrival. The windows of the apartment faced a different street, though, so I couldn't make sense of the notion. They led me through the apartment, down a hallway to a door. I noticed the single feature marking it apart from the other doors, an exterior padlock. The older man went to unlock it before being suddenly stopped by the younger. They spoke for a moment in their native language. Finally, the younger beckoned me. "Benedicta," he said. "Benedict vos blessing?" It seemed opportune, so I made the sign of the cross and imparted his request. "Benedict vos omnipus Deus, Pater et Filius et Spiritus Sanctus." The men signed themselves. The older proceeded to unlock the door. They both backed away and seemed to anticipate my entry with fear. I rotated the knob and pushed in the door. Immediately, the air hit me. Hot, roasting hot, damp and dismal. The smell. My God, the smell. Like a rotting carcass, sickly sweet and pervasive, putting your body in a state of alarm. Ammonia stung my nostrils. Were it not for my higher faculties, I would have instantly fled. The windows had been blacked out, and I could barely make out the form of a bed in the center of the room. I flipped the light switch. Before me was the immensity of human suffering, the likes of which I had never seen. On this bed was a man, or the form of a man, bound in chains and hardly discernible. His sweat-soaked skin, gray as stone, was marked with open sores. The sheets were stained with blood, feces, and urine, and he was looking right at me. He just stared. It was like looking at a doll or some other lifeless object, something so realistically human, and yet not. An uncanny valley. It was terrifying, and in the depths of my soul, I felt as if I needed to flee this place. My muscles seemed to burn with fear. My skin radiated chills up and down my entire body, and I stared into the face of something which every ounce of my unconscious mind warned me was only pretending to be human. I approached the bed, his eyes following me, bloodshot and brown, but with the unusual piercing pupils. I stood next to him, every ounce of my willpower keeping me from running and retching. I'm not sure how long we did this, but I know that I didn't blink in the entirety of it. Finally, his cold and lifeless stare took on life. His lips, deep purple and cracked, seemed to twitch. Was he speaking? Trying to speak? I held my silence and listened. I watched his face slowly contort into a wildly demented smile, chapped lips making small rips as the skin stretched. His teeth began to show, with the gum lines so worn down as not to be visible. It was entirely unnatural. The entire time, neither of us blinked. Then he whispered, "Gray." I blinked. A wicked, powerful crackling soared through his body. He was laughing at me, and it felt as if every dark deed of my life had been surfaced for the world to see. Every fear, every torment, every doubt. He cackled like some wild animal as my innermost being was laid bare. "Gray, Gray, Gray." He began shouting my name, screaming it. Beyond the voice itself were dozens of others, voices upon voices filled with hate and malice in the midst of their mockery. It was as if a chorus of fear was calling me to my basest instincts. "Gray, Gray, Gray." I turned and ran, the door of the room slamming behind me, as every instinct in my mind suddenly kicked into gear. I ran down the steps, out the door, and to my car. Even as I sat, fumbling for the keys, I could hear his unholy chorus screaming in my ears, "Gray! Gray! Gray!" Ignition. Gear. Gas. Drive. 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 I ran on instinct for miles, booking it back to St. Justine's. The sun had set, and in the darkness of the night, I ran from my car to the door of the darkening rectory, slamming it shut behind me and heading straight for the kitchen while turning on every light I could. I'm not ashamed to say that I vomited. I was absolutely beside myself with fear, anxiety, and worry. I needed some respite. I needed a break. I slowly managed to walk to the living room, collapsing into the same chair I had sat in a few hours before. And I just breathed, closed my eyes and cried, and prayed, and wondered how in hell I could have chosen this position. And then I realized that CK had not left the lights on for me. My eyes shot open, taking in the faint light around me, adrenaline pumping through my body. Where was Father Kelly? I paused for a moment, slowly standing up. Something wasn't right. I had turned the lights on, but something was off about them. I studied the room, the walls, the lamps. It was all as if viewing it through sunglasses. They were shining, but so dimly, so softly. Suddenly, fear shot into my heart. A noise rang through my head, piercing my ears and making my chest and shoulders feel as if they would burst. An explosion almost, or just a complete overwhelming of my auditory nerves. Whatever it was, it sent the animal part of my brain haywire. I felt as if I were in the sight of a predator, and there was no escape. I turned to face the door, suddenly making out the form of a massive beastly shadow. More than a shadow, just the sheer absence of light itself, like looking into death and darkness in a being, in an animal. It approached. It didn't walk, it didn't run, it just came towards me with a beastly energy of undescribable hate and malice, casting itself up, lumbering over to me. And all I could hear, all I could think, was the chorus of voices from that apartment. Gray, Gray, Gray! I fell to the floor screaming, God! Oh God, please! And in the deepness of my despair and fear, in his own small way, he seemed to answer. I heard the door of the rectory come flying open. Behind the shadow, I could barely discern the figure of Father Kelly coming into view, crucifix in hand, divine confidence making him appear almost youthful. It was the last moment of consciousness that I heard him, in a voice more commanding than any I had heard before. Oh no! No, no! No, you don't! Not here! Not in my fucking house! Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. I do hope you enjoyed the adventures of PadreGrey, because there will certainly be more of them. I think there's another 3 or 4 parts, and I would love to read them all. I've become hooked on this particular story. You can thank Glenn Jenkins for this one, too. He suggested that I read it, and I gotta say, thanks, Glenn. It was a great read. Leslie Liu, I'm still trying to get in touch with that writer, but he's ghosting me so far. But hopefully we'll have another one to read from Leslie Liu Riddle very soon. Speaking of our patrons, let's go ahead and thank them. We have, drumroll please, a new patron. Thanks to Leslie Liu Riddle and Janet Acosta for being part of our spooky skeleton army. Thanks, guys. We just couldn't do it without you. And a warm welcome to Janet Acosta. Thanks for joining us. We'd also like to thank Glenn Jenkins, our Ghostwriter tier contributor and the founder of this story, if not the writer. Thanks, Glenn. We do appreciate all you do for this channel. And I hope you enjoy the books when they make it to your house. Speaking of the writer, his name is A.S. Morrison on Wattpad or PadreGrey on Reddit. You can find him in either place, and his stories are most excellent. I can't recommend him enough, and there are links below if you'd like to check him out. I plan on reading all of the PadreGrey stories, but if you'd like to read ahead, go right ahead. I won't be offended. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.